I think Ben Horne and I first talked about recording together in 2018, not long after I was introduced to his work. But as John Lennon famously said, life is what happens when you're making other plans. And for one reason or another, we just couldn't get our schedules in sync. But I am so grateful that we were able to circle back around and make this happen. I'm a huge fan of Ben's work, and I think one of his superpowers as a photographer is capturing the quiet drama of big places, subjects and scenes that most of us would simply ignore if we even noticed them at all. It's really beautiful work, and I'm happy to finally connect with Ben to talk about it. I'm Jeffrey Sidoris, and this is my conversation with Ben Horne.
Please listen carefully.
What came first for you in terms of a love of the great outdoors or a love of photography? Did one lead to the other, or did they both arrive simultaneously? How'd that work out for you?
I would say it was the outdoors. I'd go on family camping trips when I was a kid, and actually that was the first time I went to Zion, first time I went to Glacier, went to these areas, and I was like, I don't know, 7 years old, something like that, maybe a little younger, 6 years old. And so that leaves a lasting impression. And then got more into the photography side kind of in high school. So it was the outdoors first, and then the photography side. And then of all the different types of photography out there, I was definitely drawn to the landscape, the outdoor stuff, because I could just go off on my own. It wasn't like, shooting portraits or anything like that, where you have to like work with, people. So just to go out and just have some, I'm very much an introverted person. So being able to go out and just go off on my own and find stuff has been far more appealing than try to do something where I have to work with a crew. And I have some friends who do commercial photography, and just seeing how much work goes into all those shots. I'm like, no, that is not for me. I just want to take a picture of a rock somewhere.
Right. And were you like into the Scouts or anything like that? Did you have that sort of nature/survival kind of training or background to make you feel comfortable in the outdoors, or did that come with time?
That came with time. I didn't have any sort of training for that. But much of what I do is I return to a lot of the same areas. Mm-hmm. And so you get to know those areas very well. And so you know what to expect and what sort of conditions there are, where the good places to camp are, the water sources, and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
But if I was dropped into a completely different environment, like up in the Pacific Northwest or somewhere like that, I would feel very, very much out of my element up there. So I just kind of ease into it a little bit of time, get used to it, but nothing very dramatic if it's the first time I'm going to an area, because it's very intimidating in that sense.
Yeah. Does one sort of type of topography or type of environment speak to you more? Like I grew up in California, but every summer from, the time I was 5 until college, really, we were in Arizona. And so the desert really speaks to me much more so than the mountains, for example. I mean, I can appreciate mountain environments. I can appreciate sort of forest and wooded areas, but there's still nothing that really captures me and holds me like the desert.
Yeah, for me, it's very much the same. I was born and raised here in San Diego, and so we have a lot of the deserts and stuff nearby. We're quite a ways from some of the bigger mountains and stuff. And to me, like the mountains, they're beautiful, but it's also kind of like we said, it's kind of like from a distance sort of thing.
Right.
But the desert, there's something about the accessibility. About the fact that if you see something, you can get there. You can explore quite a bit. I never had the feeling of I'm going to get lost, which I think would be a bit more of an issue in the mountains. Also, there's no bears. There's no, you don't have big wildlife. There's mountain lions, but you never really see them. You see evidence of them, but there's something about the desert that feels very kind of reassuring in a way. Agreed.
Yeah, and you have to experience it. You can't explain it. You can't explain that to someone who has never experienced it. Yeah. Yeah.
And I love going to Death Valley because of just these massive open spaces. and then the canyons of southern Utah. You get this beautiful light down in there. And the other thing too, I think that I really do enjoy about the deserts is that, especially once you get down into some of the canyons and stuff, you can find really great subjects to photograph all day long. So it's not just, certain windows when you have to have certain atmospheric conditions and everything else just lining up perfectly. You can just find like some cool looking leaves scattered on the ground with some really nice light on them and know that you have this really cool subject that other people may have just walked right past.
Right. Well, that's actually one of the things I really love about your work. I mean, when you go to these places, especially someplace like Zion or Yosemite, where, the giant wide shot of Half Dome has been done to death. That one shot where you're standing at the front of the Narrows looking in, that shot's been done to death. But you are able to find these quiet moments and make that place your own and see that place through your own eyes. And I think it's more difficult because obviously the wider, sort of more recognizable shots are easily recognizable, right? That's one of the reasons they're so well known. But there is so much interest in, as you said, a rock or a leaf or, lichen growing on something. And it becomes, I think they become almost otherworldly the closer you get to your subject in a way. If I don't, maybe it doesn't make sense, but it's honestly, it's one of the things that I keep coming back to about your work. And it's remarkable, really.
And I appreciate that. It's for me, it's far more fulfilling to find a subject like that. Because you don't feel like you're walking in someone else's footsteps. You feel like you're, able to actually find something. It takes a while to be able to start to notice subjects like that. And even some of my favorite subjects I've shot through the years, I walked past that subject maybe 3 or 4 times before I even noticed it. So it's not like I'm, zero right in on something. I think it's part of the process of just getting a little bit lost in the environment, not physically lost, but just absorbing everything around you. And there's another thing too that I call active viewing, where you're sitting there and you force yourself to look at every single thing around you. I'll stop somewhere and I'll force myself to look like all around me. If you're just out on a trail somewhere hiking along, your mind drifts a little bit, and that, even though you're seeing everything, you're not really seeing everything. And so I like to just stop every now and then, and I always tell myself that there's always going to be potential all around me. There's always something there. It's just whether you are actually paying attention to it, whether it's whether you actually want to see it or not. But there's always something there.
Right.
And there's always subjects too where if I'll find something I'm photographing, there could be another really good subject, maybe like 5-6 feet away. And the moment you stop and shoot one thing, then you'll start to notice the other things around you. And even though it can be very intimidating sometimes going to these areas and being surrounded by all this stuff, just having that peace of mind that there's opportunity in every direction. It's almost like it's like a creative license where it gives a sense of relief when you're out there.
That's a great way to put it, a sense of relief. That's great.
It is.
Yeah,
it's something that it feeds on itself, where it truly is very rewarding to find those sort of subjects. And I definitely appreciate those larger scenes, like the tunnel view at Yosemite or some of the areas in Zion. I love those scenes, but I have no real desire to photograph them, just because I feel like I'm doing something that's already been done.
Right.
And it doesn't feel like it challenges me that much.
Did you ever feel almost a responsibility to photograph those things as a landscape photographer, because they are so sort of ubiquitous with those places? Or did you know straight away that that's just not for me and I've got to forge my own trail kind of thing?
It was early on. It's these iconic scenes in landscape photography. They're very appealing when you're first getting started, because they're beautiful for a reason.
Right.
You already have this formula that's been established of, you stand here, you have this sort of light that you go for.
Right.
It's kind of like training wheels in a way. But then at a certain point, you start realizing there's so much more out there. And the other thing too, that I've noticed is that, I could take a picture of some like a red maple leaf that's trapped in some ice in some random spot in Zion, and that scene will look completely different the following day. So it's just some random red maple leaf, a random spotch of ice. But there's something about the storytelling ability of this small scene that you can use that sometimes will appeal a lot more to people than an area that they already know. So I know that sometimes people will, for example, they'll purchase a particular photo of a particular location because they have a certain memory of that location. It brings back, it makes them feel a certain way versus just a random leaf. A person has no connection to that. They've never been to that area before. But at the same time, you can tell a story with these small scenes that will make a person feel a certain way. And hopefully it'd be nice if it's something that perhaps I'm trying to imply with the photo and maybe something that drew me to that, scene to begin with.
Sure.
But it can imply something that has perhaps a larger meaning rather than simply just a location at a particular time.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why I love these small scenes and that storytelling aspect that's possible with those small scenes compared to the big ones that are more location based.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love that. And I love that you revisit, because you are seeing these things that an hour, a day, whatever it is later are going to be gone. Whereas that one tunnel view or that view of the Narrows, it's going to be there day after day after day after day. Whereas revisiting these places again and again and sort of letting the big features kind of fade away so that your brain can find the details, that's so much more interesting, I think, from not only from a creative standpoint, but from a viewer standpoint as well.
And that's one of the, I think that's one of the reasons why I love Zion. Sometimes if a person has been to Zion National Park for the first time, it's intimidating to go there. You see these huge cliffs overhead. You see these trees, sticking out of the cliffs, all these colors, and it's a very sensory overload sort of area. But then I'll go to a wash somewhere. I don't look at any of those cliffs. I appreciate that they're there, but I have zero desire to photograph those. I'm just looking for that, smaller scene somewhere. And I think sometimes it can be, I don't even know how to say it, but it might seem odd at first. Sometimes I get these comments sometimes of like, you went to Zion during the fall and you took a picture of a leaf and some dirt,
Right.
It's really rewarding though. I think it shows.
Don't yuck my yum, man.
Yeah. Even being like more aware of the surroundings, but I definitely appreciate those larger scenes. But yeah, it's those small scenes that I do enjoy.
Yeah, there is something about it. Your work has gotten me thinking about doing a project of my own, just a personal project of only photographing things on the ground and not raising my gaze beyond 45 degrees. I mean, obviously, so I don't run into things, but I love the idea of capturing things that are largely unnoticed and finding interest in that.
For sure. And here's not the tricky thing. Here's the hidden thing about it all. It's actually way easier because you have a much smaller scene where the light is more controlled. You have less variables that you're playing with, which is one of the reasons why I'm attracted to that stuff to begin with the large format camera, because there's so many, if you're juggling so many different things, it just it takes a lot out of the experience. But when you have the time to just concentrate, wait for the good light, and just kind of get everything lined up, and just it really is that same sort of peaceful experience that hopefully the photo portrays, versus one of those big chaotic scenes. And those are fun to shoot too, but there's something about shooting stuff on the ground where you can just take the time to study it, and it has more of a Zen feel to the whole process as a whole. So that actually would be kind of a cool project. And there's just so many things out there. There's so much potential out there. You'd probably find some really cool stuff.
I feel like I need to jump in here for just a second and clarify something for those of you who are listening to this and may not be familiar with Ben or his work. Ben shoots his landscapes with a large format view camera on 8x10-inch transparency film. And if you've never seen an 8x10 negative, or in Ben's case, a transparency, it is a pretty spectacular sight. The detail is absolutely incredible, and the massive size means that you can make very large prints without any loss in clarity or sharpness. Ben shows some of his transparencies on his YouTube channel in his film reveal series. I'll put a link to one of the film reveals in the show notes. And since I've never actually shot with an 8x10 camera, I asked Ben to describe the experience of seeing the world under the dark cloth. Here's what he had to say.
With large format, the image on the ground glass, it's very dim, but it's very tangible. It's also going to be upside down and backwards,
sure,
which might sound confusing to some people at first, but that's actually can be beneficial. But it takes your eyes a little bit of time to adjust. Once you are underneath the dark cloth, you're looking at the scene. What's really nice about that process, and something I've noticed in comparison to working with digital now as well, is that it's a far more intimate process, where you have the only thing you see is the image on the ground glass in front of you. You see nothing else around you.
Right.
And I remember early on, I was setting up this photo. It was on the edge of a cliff in the Grand Canyon's North Rim, in an area that's not as frequently visited. But I still remember, it's the sort of thing where I had two tripod legs mostly on the edge of the cliff.
Oh, no.
Mostly, yeah.
No.
And so I'm just kind of like underneath the dark cloth. I'm working with it. And all you do is you just see this image on the ground glass. And, think, okay, I'll just move it here. I'll do this. And then there's that moment where you pull the dark cloth from over your head and you just kind of look at it and you're like, oh, I'm on the edge of a cliff. It's that much of a separation where
wow.
It's almost like it's far more tangible because you can touch the ground glass. I'll use my fingers to measure distances between things to see if things are going to line right. So that process with large format is really, really special to it. With digital, I don't find like I have the same degree of accuracy, even with a mirrorless camera with a decent viewfinder and the rear screen. Having the bigger viewfinder would be nice. And also having it be upside down and backwards, it makes you think about it a little bit more. And it's almost when I was in college, one of my professors was talking about, if you're proofreading something, you just read it backwards, and it allows you to spot errors even better in terms of if something's not spelled right or something along those lines. And in that same sense, if you're setting up a composition, upside down, and if it's backwards, you don't think about it for what it is. You just think about it as a collection of shapes and lines and everything else. And so that also plays a pretty big role in it. But when I do set up a composition, the other thing about large format is that you're not just going to set up the camera, look through the camera, and try to figure out where to put it. You need to figure out where to put that camera before you pull the camera out.
Right.
And so it has you already thinking about, where do I need to stand specifically if it's perhaps one of those photos where moving the camera half inch to the left or right has an impact on the way that the subjects align and distractions appear and stuff. So I have like this little plastic rectangular thing I can hold up and just move around, and it just puts a rectangle on the scene without the camera. And then I just set up the tripod, set up the camera, and at that point you're just fine tuning things. But that's all very unique stuff to working with large format, even though digital makes it way easier to focus, to expose, to work in difficult windy conditions. But also those same limitations for working with film, I think, provide a greater sense of purpose to working with film. When I went on my recent trip to my January trip to Zion, there are some days when there's this beautiful snowfall, which is not a very common thing to have happen in there. And I happened to be in the right place at the right time. But there's one morning where I took a picture of this one particular tree. And then after shooting that, I felt like I was kind of like done for the day. I'm like, I exposed my sheet of film.
Wow.
I'm good. And then I just wandered around with the digital and took some pictures. And then after that, I just put the digital away. I just wandered around and just soaked in all the sights and sounds. And I didn't have that feeling of being like the chicken with its head cut off running around trying to have to capture everything. It's just working on film gave me a sense of purpose. And that's the other thing I really do enjoy about working with a large format. But also the balance of that and digital, where digital has the convenience and ability to shoot rapidly changing scenes. So they go hand in hand. And I am glad I have both. And by working with the digital, it gave me a greater appreciation for working with film, which I thought maybe I would just be lured to working more with digital. But thankfully, the film is still really has a big appeal to me.
Right. I love the idea of the advantage of composition when you've got it flipped upside down and backwards. Yeah. I had instructors in school that would tell us to draw upside down because of the same thing. You don't see this as a face, or you don't see this as a room, or whatever it is. You just see shape. You just see composition. So I would imagine that there's quite a bit of an advantage, really, in terms of strength of composition, not getting lost in the details of the composition, but rather the bigger themes that you're working with.
Yeah, and one of the good ways of describing it is that if something looks good upside down, it usually looks better right side up. But if it looks weird upside down, it usually looks worse right side up. So it seems to magnify the strengths or the weaknesses of a particular composition. I also have a friend who enjoys to edit his pictures upside down.
Oh, really?
So it actually is Simon Baxter who you've had on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Simon. Yeah, sure.
And he did a video about that a while back showing that you will notice things when you edit a picture upside down that you wouldn't notice otherwise. So that was also very, very enlightening to hear him say that.
I was always shocked not shocked, but maybe surprised that Simon didn't embrace film, and specifically large format film, for some of his woodland pictures, because there is such a depth to them, and there is such a reverence that he has for the landscape. I think his pictures would be well served by approaching them on film as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. If a person has the mentality like Simon has to put themselves in the right place at the right time to get to know the subject really, really well. And especially when working with a woodland scene where you have to find order to that chaos.
Sure.
That's definitely an area where, sliding the camera half inch to the left or right has a profound difference.
Yeah.
He would definitely do very, very, very well with that. Especially with all the intricacies of working with the subjects he works with. I know that if I were to go to some of those forests that he goes to, I would just be absolutely overwhelmed. I look at this stuff. I'm like, everything looks amazing. Right. I can't find a single photo here.
I'm going home.
Yeah, but I would appreciate every moment of it. But I would just be absolutely lost. And it would also be interesting to see how he would do if he were to come to an area like Zion or some of these canyons or the desert area, because that would also be a dramatically different environment.
Yeah.
So it'd be fascinating to see someday.
When you go out on a trip, because I know you travel a fair bit. If you don't come back with, first of all, do you have an idea of what you want to come back with when you go out on these trips? And if you don't come back with it, is it still a win because you've explored the environment and maybe you know where to go next time?
So usually when I go to an area, there's a particular subject or a particular theme that I have in mind in terms of what I want to pursue, because I like to have some degree of goals when I go out there. But you also can't let those goals become too overwhelming, because the more you fixate on whatever it is that you want to shoot, the less you're going to see what's actually there. And so this is something I've noticed when I go on my trips, where usually the first day or two or three, perhaps, I'm thinking about whatever it was that attracted me to go to that location on that particular trip. Maybe it was a particular tree I found last time I was there. I'm like, my goal is to photograph that tree. Once I get at least the first few photos out of the way, where I, satisfy that itch of, going to find that subject, at that point, I'm usually more open to my surroundings. And honestly, that's usually when I find the better subjects, because you release those expectations. And it's a balance between feeling productive, because that's, to me, one of the worst things is if I'm out on a trip, if I haven't found any subjects, if I haven't exposed any photos, then I start wondering, like, why am I even here? I'm surrounded by all this great stuff. I can't find
what am I not
shoot.
seeing?
Yeah. So you start to question yourself. And especially when you're off, if I'm especially on a backpacking trip, that voice gets louder and louder, like, because there's like no one around, because you're off in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
But what I find is just, if I have something that'll attract me to an area, and I take notes when I go on a trip. I have a little notebook, and I'll write down what I call subject discoveries. And then I'll go to those areas, and sometimes I'll look at that subject. I'm like, what was I thinking when I saw this last time? Like, there's no potential here. But in other cases, I'm very fortunate, or I'm very glad to have that, because that notebook allows me to stay productive in the field. And then as soon as I'm, done with the trip, I'll spend a lot of time, well, not done with the trip. As soon as I'm mostly done photographing on a trip, I'll spend usually a few days or so just wandering around and writing down more stuff for next time I come back and when I have more energy to do that. That one simple little notebook, I think, helps to balance that process of, those initial expectations, staying productive in the field. And at a certain point, I just get physically worn out. I'm like, all right, time to go home, time to have a shower.
Now, when you arrive someplace, are you taking the 4x5 out day one and shooting, or do you start with sort of sketch images with the digital? Do you have to sort of feel your way into it, or are you, by the time you arrive at a location, you're ready to go?
I usually, it depends on the location, but I typically want to get that first shot out of the way pretty quickly. Because if I can get that first shot out of the way, then it's like a ribbon cutting ceremony at like some new store that's opened or split.
Right.
Once you get beyond that, then you start to be more aware of your surroundings. So I do like to try to be productive. And if it's a couple days after getting there when I first take the first photo, that starts to wear me thin a little bit.
Right.
And then you start getting into this pattern. But I do try to, when I go to an area, I try to come up with a plan in terms of wandering around, trying to find interesting subjects and figuring out when the light will be best for them. And then I just start, trying to take out those shots one by one according to the weather conditions and everything else. But I definitely do try to be productive on that first day if possible.
I would imagine that helps, especially if you can get something that you go, yep, that's what I know I wanted to get that shot. It sets the tone for the rest of the trip. Or it helps to set the tone anyway.
And there's another side to that as well, which is one of the beauties of shooting film is that I have no clue if it actually turned out. So I play this little mental game with myself where I convince myself, like, let's say on that first day, I find that really cool subject, and I know deep down it's probably pretty decent. But if I'm very happy with it, then I'm not going to be as motivated to keep finding more subjects.
Right.
So I go out of my way to convince myself that I messed up that photo.
Really?
My exposure was too short.
Really?
It was too long. Maybe when I pulled the dark slide, maybe there was a little light leak. And I just dismiss that photo as though it doesn't even exist.
Interesting.
Which keeps me hungry to find more and more pictures.
Right.
And, but at a certain point, maybe if it's like a week into a trip, I'll get to a point where I'm like, yeah, I can't fool myself anymore. If I shot all these photos,
I'm not falling for it anymore.
I have to have something in here. I mean, like I couldn't have messed up every single one of those photos. Right. And so that's usually at the point where I'm like, all right, I think I'm pretty good. But overall, if I get one solid photo out of a trip, I'm pretty happy with it. But it's more so getting to know an area, exploring further. And if I can put some more notes in that little notebook in terms of subject discoveries, that to me makes it where I feel more like it was a decent success because it lays the groundwork for perhaps future trips. But if I get one photo, I'm happy. Anything more than that, it's just bonus stuff.
Right. And do you process the film and look at it immediately, or do you when you return from a trip, do you have to let it sit for a bit and sort of, let yourself get at peace with it, or are you kind of eager to just let's see what we got immediately?
So I typically drop the film off at the lab not long after getting back, within a day or so. And then part of the process I do is I'll record what I call a film reveal video, which is where I take a look at the film for the first time on camera.
Right.
And I do that mostly to record the initial reaction to seeing the images, because I've always been fascinated with how our perception with our own work changes with time. And sometimes there's a photo that I might think is really great at first. And then at a certain point, I realized, no, that's not that great. But there was this one that I didn't think much of when I first saw it that grows and grows and grows. And eventually I realized that's the better photo from the trip. I started recording these videos partially for that reason, but also partially just as a educational thing for other people that might be curious about shooting film and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
So there's that process where I see it. Then I will typically scan the pictures and and start working on the videos. And the videos usually come out about a month or so after I get back from the trip. So there's this pause of, seeing the film, working with it, and then about a month later, to the point where I actually start showing some of the pictures. And in that time, my perception changes a little bit. So it's really nice to have that about 1 month separation, because I'm not going to post any of those pictures until the videos come out.
Right.
And so it's like this nice little buffer that allows me to hopefully finalize my thoughts on them. And at that point, I've then done the videos and share that perception with them. But yeah, if I were, and that's a thing too, if I was shooting primarily digital, I'd probably still force myself to do that in terms of I'd download them, but I wouldn't really pay too much attention to, wait a month or so.
Right.
And then start going through them, because then I feel like I can know those pictures a little bit better and have formulated my thoughts on them a little bit more, and whether they were successful or not.
I mean, that's one of the things that maybe even the thing I miss the most about film is letting yourself almost forget about what it was that you shot, and having that moment of discovery, having that moment of wow, I got this. I didn't know that I did. I thought I did,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't really know. I know a photographer. His name's Ollie Kellett, who
Mm-hmm.
he shoots street, medium format, beautiful sort of. I don't even know how to describe it. They're these beautiful sort of cinematic cityscapes, but he
Mm-hmm.
won't look at the photographs until the following year. So he'll shoot a body of work one year, and he won't look at it until the following year when he started a new body of work. So he has that entire year of letting himself really completely forget about the experience and be surprised about it and rediscover the work for himself all over again, which I find fascinating.
That's a lot of restraint.
Right. I couldn't do
that.
it. I couldn't do it.
Does he post stuff on any sort of social media stuff at all?
No,
or
not in the interim. He doesn't look at it at all.
Well, I mean, in terms of like, does he eventually post them out?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's very. I like that approach. Mm-hmm. I would not be able to do that with my stuff, because I'm like, here's my trip from last year,
Right.
But that could have worked well during the pandemic, because that was fresh stuff coming out, during everything that happened. But yeah, I really admire that sense of restraint, and I can see how that would be very much a part of one's process to really just separate from the events and everything else, and have a better feeling for how it all works as a whole.
Right.
That's really cool.
As you might imagine, I've had quite a few conversations with artists and makers over the past year or so of lockdown, and each of them has had a very different reaction, both personally and creatively. Since so much of your work involves being alone in the natural world, I'm curious to hear how your life and your approach to the work has been affected by the pandemic.
So it hasn't really impacted directly in terms of the trips I've gone on, the places I've been.
Mm-hmm.
And it has, right when the pandemic began, was I basically quit my day job just to pursue photography, because I'd been laying the groundwork for that ever since 2017 or so. I was just taking one day off my work week each year. And then last year I was set to be working just 1 day a week. And then this year was going to be just doing my photography stuff full time.
Mm-hmm.
So when the pandemic happened, I just, everything was closing down, because I was working part-time at a camera store. But when everything was closing down, I just realized, well, I'm just kind of off on my own, doing my own thing now, which is good, but also is a little intimidating, because it's like, all right, now I got to make this all work.
Right.
But one thing that happened, though, is all the trips in 2020, well, with the exception of my first trip of the year, because that was before the pandemic, but I had 3 trips in 2020. And even though, yes, they were affected to some degree by the pandemic, it was more so the fact that I couldn't really get away. I couldn't get the pandemic out of my head.
Sure.
When going on the trip. So, and that had a very negative impact on the trips, in terms of wanting to go to some of these areas as an escape.
Mm-hmm.
But then you get there and you realize it's not an escape.
Right.
And even like a wilderness area where there's no one around, but you still feel like the pandemic is kind of following you into the wilderness, and it makes it hard to concentrate on working. So in that case, it did have a very negative impact. though I'll say that the trips I've had 2 trips so far this year, one in January to Zion and then one in March to Death Valley. Those ones were like a complete breath of fresh air. And I don't know exactly what the difference was. Maybe it's because things weren't closed down as much. Maybe things started opening up a little bit. But those ones were completely different. And I'm still trying to figure out why that is. But I feel like I was more aware of the subject and I was working far better than any other past trips. So maybe it's just the contrast.
Would we be able to see those differences as an audience, or are they subtle to an audience but obvious to you as the maker?
I had some people comment, because so far I've posted the videos from the first trip, and I've had some people comment saying, you just seem like you were very happy out there. And so I think it does show in that sense. To me, it was a bit like when I first started going on these trips, because when I first started going on these trips, I didn't rely on them for any source of income. It was just it was actually during after the big Great Recession back in 2008, 2009. That's when I started going on these trips, because I was working at the same camera store, and no one's going to go into a camera store and buy cameras when all of a sudden all the stock market's crashing and everything else is going on.
Your house might be gone the next week.
Exactly. There's so much turmoil going on. And so, the business dropped off like crazy because it was just, unnecessary spending for most people. And so the owners of the shop were just looking for any sort of suggestions people had. And I said, hey, I'll go off into the wilderness somewhere. I'll go take pictures for a week. Don't pay me. I had enough savings where I was able to pay the bills and stuff. And so that's how I started going on these trips to begin with.
But they kept you on as an employee in the interim.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that worked out pretty well off in the beginning. So that's kind of how I got started with all this. And back then when I'd go on those trips, and I did maybe 5 trips in 2009.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot. Yeah. And some of them were like 2 weeks or so,
Yeah, that's a lot.
And so on those ones, it actually did very much feel like an escape, getting off into the wilderness, going off into these areas, because, I didn't really there's no pressure on me in terms of trying to generate an income from it. It was just going off and seeing these places I'd seen pictures of before and I was curious about.
Sure.
And so I think the trips earlier this year felt a bit more like that, which was a really, really good feeling. Especially when, I don't know, it was really nice the way it worked out. And the big test is going to be, I'll be doing a backpacking trip in the next couple of weeks or so, into some obscure canyons in Utah. And those are the ones where my mind kind of gets the most of me sometimes. You realize I am like, 10 miles away from my truck, which is somewhere off in the middle of nowhere.
Which I think is in that direction.
Yeah. Like you're down in these canyons where it feels a bit maze-like. You feel a little trapped sometimes.
Right.
So those are the ones where the solitude can get the best of me. And when I went on my trip to that location last year, I drove to the location, and there was something weird with the thermometer in my 4Runner, where it showed it was getting hotter and hotter and hotter outside, to the point where I think it said it was like 94 degrees or something like that, which was above my own internal safety limit in terms of hiking into some of these areas.
Right.
And so I get there and I realized the thermometer was reading wrong, so it wasn't that hot.
Right.
But I got to this trailhead and I put in 11,000 steps that day, all of which was me pacing around at the trailhead, just because I'm like, why am I here?
Should I do this? What am I doing?
Exactly. Just getting in my own head about it.
Wow. How'd you get through it?
Just by doing it.
Yeah.
I think that's the main thing. And so I went in there, and sure enough, I found 2 subjects to photograph, one of which I didn't quite get right, that I'm going to try again this time. And that kind of gets to the whole thing of, I drove, 12 hours to get this area. I hike into it, and then I just take a picture of some dried, curled up mud underneath a rock in some random canyon in the middle of nowhere.
All right, I'm done.
And I'm sitting here. Yeah, I'm just sitting here like, well, this makes sense. you know? So
I only have to do this 476 more times this month to make a living.
exactly. So it's like the pressure that comes with trying to like you go out going off into the wilderness and trying to find some interesting pictures. Yes, that's great. But if you have the pressure of I have to come back with some pictures I'm really proud of,
Right.
that takes it to another level. But thankfully on the trips I had earlier this year, they're very productive. I felt really good about them. It gives me a good sense of direction for the rest of the year. Because my goal is to end up just with 10 pictures I'm really happy with, enough to do a box set, enough to do the videos and stuff. And so yeah, it's definitely feeling way better now. And I'm sure you've probably had hopefully a similar experience as well, as things are starting to open up and we're getting our shots and all that sort of stuff.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to touch on, and please don't get too specific, but because I don't want it to be kind of an invasive question, but it seems like your audience has been very willing to come on this journey with you. Am I off base on that, or does it feel that way to you, that they're willing to be a support system because they want to and believe in the work, they want to see that work in the world? Is that the way it feels for you?
It does. And there's something, and I wonder if partially it might be because I've been doing this for a while now. But also when I put the videos on the YouTube channel, I shut off the ads many, many years ago because I did not like the direction it forces people.
Right. And just on a side note, respect. Absolutely. I mean, that's such a, it's so antithetical to a certain segment of the maker market right now. I have an immense amount of respect for you for choosing that.
I appreciate that. And a lot of it comes from me being incredibly stubborn. Stubbornness can be a good thing because my whole thing with photography is I want it to be something that I enjoy. And I made a promise to myself way back that I didn't want to pursue photography unless I was doing something I actually wanted to do. And if at any point it felt like work, I didn't want to do that, because I didn't want to take something I love, which is photography, and make it into something that becomes work, which is something I then despise.
Right.
And along those same lines, when you have a platform like YouTube, which is ad driven, if you have ads on the channel, you're rewarded by having more views on the videos, which then leads towards clickbait and then specific topics to gather attention. And I'm a very non-attention seeking person. And to me, it would feel like work, and it'd feel like a betrayal of myself to put out stuff that is simply designed to attract attention. And I felt like I was just being rewarded for the wrong reason.
Right.
And so it was a bit of an act of rebellion to shut off the ads and then say, I don't want to go that direction. I just want to be stubborn and do what I want to do. And I think after, over 10 years now of doing that, it grows the channel incredibly slowly. I mean, it's like a snail's pace.
Right.
But I think it does attract people that are more invested in it. And so it becomes enough people watching, even though it's not a very large subscriber base compared to many channels. I really define the success by the fact that I'm able to do what I love and able to share that with people, and that people are invested in it. To me is very, it's very, very heartwarming to see that.
Right.
Because it means that they're actually responding to the real me instead of just putting out, tips and tricks videos and all that sort of stuff.
5 ways you can get better large format photos. Yeah.
And it's always odd numbers. It's always odd numbers for the tips and tricks. 5, 7, 3, never 4 tips, never 6 tips. 10,
no, that would just be wrong.
10 works sometimes. Yeah.
I would love to see, talking about all this, I would love to see someone address sort of social media for introverts, because the entire kind of algorithmic approach to social media is you have to be there all the time, multiple times a day, multiple ways. Like, all of this stuff is based on consistency and repetition. And I'm right there with you. I mean, it's one of the reasons I don't do anything. I get asked to do video a lot, and I can't do it because I don't want to be out there in that way.
Yeah.
And I know that I'm limiting my own potential success, audience size, etc. The same thing with Instagram. I won't post 3 times a day or even once a day or even consistently every week because it just feels expected and not authentic. And I know that word gets battered around a lot lately, but there is an authenticity to your presence online, and hearing you talk about it now makes me appreciate it even more.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's I don't know. I think it stems from that sense of stubbornness, and it definitely sounds like you have that as well, where it's just, if there's something, and there's like this force that's trying to push you in a certain direction, in terms of, like you said, with whether it's the Instagram or all that sort of stuff. And I don't know about you, but I've always been one to kind of follow my own path and just do my own thing. Like I've never been one to, if there's a whatever popular dance craze is going on or whatever, like, yeah, that's
dance craze, really, Ben? That's where we're gonna go.
Exactly. Anything like that, I'm just like, no, whatever the crowd's doing, they can enjoy that,
right?
But I will have no, I'm not going to get anything out of that.
Yeah.
And so one of the analogies I like to say is that, if you follow your own path, you never really know where you're going to end up, but it's so much more rewarding.
Sure.
And it takes a long time. That's the other thing too. I think with the internet, with social media, with all that sort of stuff, there's a lot of people that are, they want that instant, quick, they want to, grow their Instagram account. They want to do this, they want to do that. But very seldom in life is anything that is instant and that is kind of an overnight success. Very rarely, I think, is that truly satisfying. I think if it's slowly built over time, you build that foundation, you go the direction that you want to go, as opposed to being pulled in a particular direction. I think that's far more satisfying in the long run. Yeah,
I think there's some truth to that. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think that when you do have millions, let's say, you have to feed the beast, right? You have to keep, in order to maintain that level of engagement, you've got to feed the beast. And I think that the way you are doing, the way you're approaching your work and the way you're approaching your presence online feels like it mirrors the sustainability of your work. It feels like it's commensurate with how you're producing the work. It's not artificially inflated just to get eyeballs.
And there's a lot of truth to that. And I also, I will do things to, it sounds overly dramatic if I say intentionally sabotage, but like I almost fear that if the channel does grow, that it would have a negative impact. And I even know this based on some of the areas I go, like I don't even, there's a lot of places where I won't shoot videos, or I won't shoot videos. Well, maybe I'll shoot photos, but I'll limit on how I share them. But the greater the audience, the more I have this feeling of like these eyes looking over my shoulder. And it's not a good thing. I don't like that. If a channel had like 1 million subscribers, I would probably be very happy finding some way to like cut that down dramatically, or just start over again, or something like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's why I choose like specific, very boring titles for my videos, because I don't want like YouTube to like say, check out this guy. He takes pictures with like an end table or whatever,
Well, and I think like we talked about earlier, it's very obvious that you feel, let's see, how can I say this? You feel a responsibility and a sense of stewardship to the environments that you photograph. And I think limiting how those places are presented and represented allows you to do the work that you feel drawn to do, but still sort of protect the place in which you do it. Does that make sense?
It does. And there's a whole movement called Nature First, which is in response directly to, I think, social media in particular, but also just online culture when it comes to, location sharing and people posting pictures in very sensitive areas and not having a good source of education about the areas that they visit.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll see sometimes people go to an area and post pictures, and they're not mindful of the wake that they create in terms of by posting a picture, then other people will see an area, they want to go there, and there isn't this sort of education about these areas. These areas can't handle it. So it's definitely been a growing concern. And I think it was back in, 2014, 2015 is when I started to see the effect of some of that stuff. So then I started becoming more like reclusive in terms of like, not saying specific names of areas or just being very broad or intentionally misleading. So it definitely has been an issue, especially with like location tagging on Instagram and stuff like that. I'll just use completely random, non-related location tags for my pictures, usually ones that sound kind of funny, just as a source
just
of
to throw
rebellion.
people off.
Yeah.
I think Simon's the same way. Simon doesn't share where he shoots a lot of his woodland pictures for exactly the same reasons.
Yeah, especially since he works in an area that is basically his own backyard.
Right.
And so you have to be very protective of an area like that, because once stuff gets out, it gets out there and there's no reeling it back in. So there's an argument I hear sometimes people say, or when I posted about this maybe back in 2014, 2015, where I said how, I'm just going to not mention locations or anything like that. There are some people that will accuse one of being elitist or a gatekeeper or something along those lines. Yeah, and I got some really nasty remarks to that because people felt offended that
they're entitled to know where you went.
Yeah,
wow.
And the thing that I found interesting is that these particular areas, no one told me about them.
Right.
I found them based on doing Google Earth and just following my curiosity and revisiting areas again and again.
Right.
But there were some people that felt entitled that if I didn't tell them that, they would, use that sort of language.
No way.
But thankfully, there's been a big shift lately, where now it's going in a better direction in that sense. I think because people have seen the impact of these areas that once to be these beautiful, pristine areas, they get trampled. There's vandalism. So thankfully things have been going in a good direction. But it's definitely something I've noticed through the years.
Have you seen? I mean, we talked about it a little bit at the beginning about seeing people sort of carve their names into things. Have you seen reactions to that sort of curtailing that kind of behavior, or do you still see that kind of behavior on the rise?
Still see it on the rise.
Really?
Wow. And then this past year was by far the worst I have seen it. And it's really disheartening to see that, because never once have I gone through some of these like slot canyons with sandstone. I'm like, man, I wish I could just write my name in this wall right here. Right. It's never occurred to me. And then you see like some like spray paint in areas too. Not a lot, but there's just a little bit of that. And so it has been getting worse. So I'm curious as how things are going to change once we're in the post-pandemic times. And hopefully some of this will settle back down. But even before the pandemic, it was just getting worse and worse and worse. And it's always areas that are easily accessible. You never see that way off in the backcountry, but areas that are easily accessible. Is it an education issue? Is it an enforcement issue? Is it a combination of both? I mean, is it combatable, I guess is the bigger question. I think my fear is that it is just a deeply rooted part of human nature, where if you see something that's not yours, that you want to put a mark on it to say that you were there. I think that's just because these people clearly don't like, pull out a butter knife and like scratch their name in the drywall in their own house. But they go to some other area. Yeah. Like they've proven that they can restrain from doing that.
Right.
But there's, I think, something about that. And another thing that has come up recently, which has become a bigger issue lately, and it seems innocent at first, but cairns, which are rock stacking, so like stacked rocks, they're used to designate trails in certain areas, but most people will never see those because they're probably not going to go on the trails way off in the middle of nowhere where that's
where they
actually
would
a thing.
be. Yeah.
Yeah. So people don't typically run into the navigational cairns out there, but what has risen a lot through the years are these recreational cairns. So people just create these elaborate, stacks of rocks and then just leave them there. And it doesn't seem like that big of a deal to be like, if you just on surface level, it's like, oh, it's just rocks, they'll fall down and all that. But what it is it's a person leaving their mark on the environment for other people to see. And there should be zero need for that whatsoever.
Other than functionally, as you said, marking trails, etc.
Yeah. Like for a navigational cairn, it's there for a reason. You shouldn't add to them. You shouldn't destroy them. Some of them are officially built by the National Park Service, but very few people run into those. But these recreational cairns that people set up, they're usually, sometimes they're like 3-4 feet tall. Sometimes they have like heart-shaped rocks, and they may have been created by good-meaning people. But also, to me, it looks a bit like coming home after a long day of work, maybe back in the college years when you have roommates, and then someone just stacked all these dirty dishes in the sink. It's like you left a reminder of yourself.
Pyramid of Coors cans on the table or something.
Yeah. It's like, this is completely like when I go to often to these wilderness areas, I want to have that wilderness experience. I want to know that rock is there because a flash flood came through and it rearranged things in a particular way.
Right.
There was another area I went to in Zion. This is often a backcountry area where no one ever really goes. And there was like this big sandstone slope that kind of gradually evens out to the point where it's basically just level ground. And there were some rocks that had tumbled down from that slope. And they're all arranged down there. And they've kind of fallen into these grooves in the sandstone. And they're arranged in this really beautiful way. And there are some of these rocks that are on top of other rocks. And just walking between those, I didn't want to accidentally kick one of them and disturb it, because I'm like, this rock could have been here for 10,000 years.
Right. Right.
It was placed there by the elements. It's almost like a spiritual experience walking between those and having this feeling of, just how short we are here compared to how long everything is there. And then walking through a wash somewhere else in the park and seeing all these stacks of rocks and just being completely thrown out of the experience. So my whole thing with the recreational ones, I'll carefully disassemble those. But even that now, like in one of my videos from my January trip design on the first video, there's just a quick clip of me just, disassembling one of the recreational cairns. And I got so much hate for that.
Really?
It was really weird because people think I'm like trying to destroy their sign of respect to the environment.
Interesting.
Like you're leaving dirty dishes out.
Yeah, interesting.
And the people had written their names on one of the rocks. And I'm like, and someone said, yes, they were just good meaning people. They wanted to enhance the environment.
With their names.
Well, they wrote their name on the rock.
Right.
And nature doesn't need enhancement.
Right.
So
right.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, but yeah.
I mean, do you consider yourself an environmentalist, a conservationist, both, neither?
Some degree of that. I think once you see some of these beautiful areas and you see how they're supposed to be, and then you see certain changes happening, it's hard not to look at that and say, this is okay.
Yeah. If you were of that mindset, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so in terms of conserving what's there, definitely. And I mean, even if we just keep the status quo, that to me, I think that would be a lofty goal, just the way that things are going. And also once you realize how interconnected absolutely everything is, then you start thinking about your own actions in terms of like, here I'm driving 8 hours to get to this area to take a picture of some rocks and leaves. Is this really necessary? And so yeah, you start I think thinking about these bigger picture things. But at least in that sense, it seems like we're going in a better direction in terms of having better electric vehicles that can get to these areas and having the infrastructure. So yeah, it's a tricky thing because we have to balance, who we are as a society, but also protecting these areas and keeping them pristine to at least have that experience of getting out there.
It feels like in talking to you now, there's at least a part of your experience that requires more effort than, let's say, it did 5 or 10 years ago. You have to go further afield to get to some place that hasn't been touched or marred by people. Is that fair?
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have to work harder to get away from the people. That's, and then hope they don't follow me. That's the other important. Yeah.
That's another part that we haven't even talked about. I'm sure that, people see guy with backpack and camera, off in the distance. They're going to go, "Wow, where's he? He must know where he's going. Where's he off to? Let's go follow him and see where he's going."
Yeah. If I go to, certain areas, whether it's like Zion or somewhere, and I'm in an area kind of away from all the established trails and stuff, areas where it's okay to go off trail in some of these areas.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do this sort of move where I'm just like walking down the road casually, waiting, and all of a sudden, wait for a gap in cars, and I'll just kind of dart off into the bushes. And I'm like, all right, hopefully no one saw me go there.
Right,
so literally, I don't want anyone to follow me back in there. But also just being mindful of the digital wake we leave behind in terms of hoping to inspire people to perhaps find subjects of their own and maybe small stuff that's, is at their feet.
Mm-hmm.
But not saying, don't go to this exact canyon I went to, but find your own canyon, find something because you'll value it more.
Right.
And I think that's the important underlying issue.
But you may have. I mean, it's certainly in a period of thousands of years, you may be the first set of human eyes to experience this environment. And that has to be an incredible experience.
It is. And I mean, even if it's something as simple as, like when I was in Death Valley, I was climbing up a hillside. I'm like, I know that many people have climbed up this hillside before, but what are the odds that I'm the first person to ever touch this rock? Mm-hmm. It's just, there's something kind of nice about that. And sometimes you don't have to go too far off the beaten path at all to find some areas where you can tell that very few people have been to. Because people usually stick to the really popular and common areas. But then also in the human history of it all, you have the Native Americans that this was their home and everything. And I think it's always fascinating to think to how, people survived in these areas and thrived in these areas. And then here I am just a visitor versus this was their home. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really remarkable. I have so much respect for the work that you produce and the way that you produce it. I mean, it's one thing to make the work the center of the experience, but it really feels like you are one of those photographers for whom the work is a byproduct of the experience.
It is. And it's also kind of interesting because, I mean, I do, I take pictures of leaves and rocks and twigs and stuff. That's kind of the joke I have between me and my wife. I'll go off in somewhere and just take pictures of leaves and rocks and twigs and stuff.
Don't forget mud.
And mud, yes, mud's very important. But the actual product is really just the video of that.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it still is amazing that any of this is possible. That one can go off in these areas and kind of do their own thing and just bring along a video camera as well and put together the videos and stuff after the fact. But that is enough to actually be able to earn a living from it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm very, very, very grateful for that ability, and especially the timing of it all, with it getting started with the Great Recession and then kind of, making me jump into the pool a little faster with the pandemic and everything else that's happened. So
where do you go next when the world kind of opens back up? Where creatively, logistically, physically, what's next on your radar once you can sort of get back out into the world without the same kind of restrictions?
Mostly the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the beauty of it. Earlier on, I was figuring, hey, once I have the ability to do all this on my own, which I do now, and once the pandemic restrictions are lifted, then I'll go on more trips and stuff. And I'll probably work a couple more trips here and there. One of my things is go on some trips and just not bring the video camera. Maybe go on some trips and just not bring the still camera, just to have more of an experience out there.
Right.
Maybe just a actual backpacking trip to just cover a lot of ground. But I have more flexibility to do that. But the main thing is just since I am so stubborn in my ways, which has worked really well for me for the past time, I just want to kind of keep going on the course and see where it goes, but nothing dramatic. I know people have ambitions of traveling the world and do that, and I'll just drive around my 4Runner into some nondescript canyon somewhere and enjoy my time out there. Yeah,
it's great. It's really great. I mean, I think you are kind of well, certainly. I mean, I'm going to say anomaly, and I don't mean this in a bad way at all. I think it's you are proof that you don't need, 17 million followers and these ridiculous clickbaity titles and over the top photos to have an honest, authentic, and meaningful career as a maker circa 2021, 22, right?
Yeah.
Because I think there is a trajectory, certainly that younger makers, photographers, artists, writers, filmmakers, I don't think it really matters what the discipline or the vehicle is, but there's a certain trajectory that has been sort of spoon-fed and bought into that you have to follow. And it is so refreshing to see not only work with integrity, but the presence of you in sort of representing the work and putting the work out into the world, proceeding with that same kind of integrity.
Yeah, I think with all the social media stuff, and what it asks of a lot of people, I think I can only imagine it's got to be incredibly unfulfilling to try to keep up with that, especially as things are changing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it definitely shows that, there is possibility to make it work. And the key thing is just being genuine with it all and not trying to follow the trends and being stubborn. Stubborn's good. Stubborn's really good.
You can see Ben's work on his website at benhorne.com. That's BENHORNE.com. He's also got a terrific YouTube channel where he shares film reveals, reflections on his photographic process, and some really great behind-the-scenes videos of his trips all over the Southwest, including his recent trip to Zion. Just search for Ben Horne on YouTube. You can also find him on Instagram at Ben Horne Photo. Subscribe to Process Driven in your favorite podcast app, or you can get everything I produce, every Process Driven, every in-between, every iteration, and any one-off conversation that I may do, all in one feed by subscribing to Jeffrey Sidoris Everything. You can support the shows by leaving a review or a rating wherever you listen, or by sharing them on your own social media. I've also just relaunched my newsletter with a new title and a more refined focus. It's called Create and Release, and you can read the first issue and subscribe on my website at jeffreysidoris.com, which is JEFFERYSADDORIS.com. You can also connect with me on Instagram and Twitter and Clubhouse at Jeffrey Sidoris. And if you'd like to share some feedback or let me know what you're working on, email me at talkback@jeffreysidoris.com. I'd love to hear from you. I'll be back in a week or so with another show, and I hope you'll join me. Until then, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'll talk to you on the next one.